1991, southern Iraq, near the outskirts of Basra. Under a blistering desert sun, a line of Republican Guard T-72s sat in ambush, dug into sand berms. With gun barrels leveled at a choke point, they waited for the approaching American armor. The range 200 meters suicidally close in tank warfare, but for the Guard, this was the comfort zone. Close in, frontal arc, direct fire, then the Abrams appeared. Two hulking silhouettes crested the ridge, M1A1s cutting through the haze like predators. The first T-72 gunner locked on, steadied the reticle, and fired. A deafening crack, a thunderclap of release, and the 125mm sabot round hissed across the desert like a hypersonic spear. Impact. Dust and debris exploded off the Abrams front plate. It didn't stop. The M1 kept rolling, turret already turning. No fire, no smoke, no damage, just steel, defiant and undeterred. A second T-72 fired another hit. Again, no effect. Then the Abrams fired back. What came next wasn't a tank duel, it was a slaughter. Within 60 seconds, 5 T-72s were smoking wrecks. One had its turret blown clear off. The others burned from internal detonations. Survivors scrambled out, choking on fumes, screaming into radios. From the rear, Soviet advisors embedded with the Guard forces stared through binoculars, stunned into silence. The 125mm was supposed to pierce anything. They'd run simulations, conducted penetration trials. The numbers had promised destruction. Instead, they'd found something else, an American tank that could walk through their best firepower like it was rain. The Soviet model was unraveling, not in theory, but in real time, and in those burning sands, every assumption about armored supremacy died before the smoke cleared. For over a decade, Soviet engineers had studied NATO armor designs, fed by a constant stream of intelligence reports, field analysis, and testing on captured Western tanks. They believed they understood the game. They believed in velocity, in mass, in the sheer unstoppable penetration force of their 125mm smoothbore gun. At under 500 meters, they believed, no tank on Earth could survive a properly placed APF-SDS round. This wasn't arrogance. It was math. Formulas backed by field trials and reinforced by confidence in Soviet metallurgy. On test ranges outside Nizhny Tagil, crews had vaporized old West German Leopards and American M60s. In training manuals and classified journals, the T-72's 125mm gun was referred to as decisive. Even NATO acknowledged it was formidable. On paper, it was a tank killer. But there was a problem, one that didn't appear in the calculations. No one had fought the Abrams. Not for real. In the 1980s, Western tanks were still theoretical enemies. Intelligence officers relied on grainy satellite photos, rumors, and heavily sanitized export data. No Warsaw Pact crew had ever faced a NATO main battle tank in combat. The wars in the Middle East, from the Arab-Israeli clashes to Lebanon, had used outdated export models and poorly trained crews. So when the Abrams began deploying in significant numbers during the buildup to Operation Desert Storm, Soviet planners weren't alarmed. It's just another tank. One Warsaw Pact advisor said, heavy. Yes. Advanced. Yes. But no machine can defy physics. That belief hardened into doctrine. Inside briefing rooms from Warsaw to Baghdad. Red arrows pointed at blue tanks on sand-colored maps. T-72s would close to 800 meters. Fire first, destroy with shock. The Iraqi Republican Guard was trained to fight by these assumptions, and then the war came and shattered every one of them. Abrams tanks didn't behave like anything Soviet officers had imagined. They struck from twice the expected range. They didn't die from direct hits. They fought at night. They moved faster than their tonnage allowed. And they brought with them not just armor, but an entire ecosystem of battlefield awareness and targeting systems that Soviet manuals hadn't accounted for. What was supposed to be a duel became a ghost fight. Soviet firepower found its mark and did nothing. The room of assumptions didn't just collapse, it exploded. Soviet tank doctrine, forged in the bitter crucible of World War II and refined through countless Cold War war games, prioritized mass and momentum. The idea was simple tanks operate in echelons. The first wave punches through, the second overwhelms. Numbers compensate for losses. Speed ensures survivability. Surprise wins battles. But it was all built on one condition: parity. Soviet engineers didn't design the T-72 to survive a first hit. It was designed to fire first. With its autoloader shaving precious seconds off reload time, with its lower silhouette making it harder to target, the T-72 was a tank made for offensive tempo. Survivability was statistical, not tactical. If a crew was lucky, they'd get off 2 shots before being hit. If they weren't, the next tank in line would finish the job. This logic was encoded into their formation structures, their engagement ranges, even their training cycles. Tank gunnery emphasized speed over precision. Movement drills focused on group tactics rather than individual survivability. The assumption was always that both sides would be vulnerable, so the victor would be the one who struck hardest and fastest. Then came the Abrams. With its Chobham composite armor, layered with classified ceramics and space steel, the M1 didn't play by the same rules. At combat ranges of 2,500 meters or more, Abrams crews could identify, range, and destroy T-72s before their opponents even got a return reading. Worse, the Americans didn't need to mass their armor. They operated in independent hunter-killer teams with advanced thermal sights that made night a non-factor. Soviet planners had no answer for this. Their doctrine hadn't anticipated a tank that could take a hit from 125 mm APF SDS at 400 meters and keep going. It hadn't anticipated thermal imaging that could see through smoke, dust, and darkness. It hadn't anticipated armor formations guided by satellites and supported by GPS-coordinated airstrikes. When doctrine met reality, the T-72s burned. And for Soviet tacticians watching from afar, the revelation wasn't just technical. It was existential. The night of February 25, 1991, the 1st Armored Division encountered what was believed to be the last major line of Iraqi Republican Guard resistance near al-Busayya. Intelligence expected a battalion-level engagement, possibly dug in with prepared fields of fire. What actually unfolded became a case study in technological shock and Soviet disbelief. At 1,500 meters, M1 Abrams tanks advanced under cover of darkness, guided by thermal sights and real-time communications from command posts and aerial assets. Ahead of them lay a screen of T-72s camouflaged and motionless, awaiting the expected frontal assault. The terrain was flat, visibility low, and temperatures cold enough to warp infrared contrast. But none of it mattered. Abrams gunners identified the heat signatures first. Stationary tanks lit up on their screens like bright orange silhouettes. Within seconds, coordinates were relayed, turrets adjusted, and the first rounds fired. The first hit struck a T-72 squarely on the turret ring. The entire top half of the tank sheared off in a blinding explosion. Seconds later, another round punched through a second tank's front armor, igniting ammunition and ejecting flames through the hatch. Then another, and another. In under 90 seconds, 6 Iraqi tanks were reduced to wreckage. None had returned fire. Radio intercepts later captured stunned Iraqi commanders yelling in confusion. "They are shooting from darkness," one voice barked. "No flashes. We cannot see them." Soviet advisors listening in from hardened command bunkers stared in disbelief at the unfolding telemetry. Impact logs were recording hits from impossible distances. Soviet range engagement models capped effective fire at 2,000 meters. Anything beyond was statistically unreliable. The M1s were scoring first-round kills beyond 2,800 meters. It defied expectations. It defied training. It defied physics as the Soviet generals understood it. The 125mm smoothbore was supposed to be a one-shot kill against any NATO tank under 1,000 meters, but the Abrams was ignoring the rules. Worse, the battlefield sensors picked up something no one could explain. Several Abrams tanks had taken hits, confirmed penetrations on paper, yet continued moving, firing, and communicating with full effectiveness. There were no secondary explosions. No catastrophic kills. T-72 rounds were hitting and bouncing off. Back in Moscow, a classified report landed on the desk of a senior Gray U analyst with a single hand-scrawled note in the margin. What armor is this for the Soviets? The impossible had just become reality. The first reports that trickled into Soviet military intelligence were dismissed as exaggerations or worse, misinformation. How could a tank survive a direct hit from a 125mm sabot round? How could it destroy 5 enemy vehicles before being seen? The numbers defied not only doctrine, but physics as they had defined it. In a closed-door session at the General Staff Academy in Moscow, high-ranking officers pored over intercepted battlefield telemetry from Iraq. Some of it came from Iraqi sources, some from passive Soviet satellite observation. What it showed was staggering multiple Abrams tanks, shrugging off hits that should have penetrated clean through, engaging from outside the effective range of Soviet optics, and maneuvering in the dark like it was daylight. The skepticism was immediate and sharp. General Viktor Filatov, a senior armor officer, reportedly slammed his fist on the table. "It's propaganda. No tank is invincible." Another, more cautious, officer suggested American electronics were skewing range readings. Perhaps their thermal sights were misreporting distance to targets. Others speculated that the Iraqis weren't using their ammunition correctly, or that the tanks in question were older export models, not real T-72s. They were wrong. By the second week of Desert Storm, the photographic evidence was irrefutable. Recon satellites captured high-resolution imagery of destroyed Republican Guard tank columns, some with turrets blown clean off, others with penetration marks showing clean entry holes in front plates previously thought impervious. And beside the wreckage, in perfect formation, were Abrams tanks still intact, engines idling, crews dismounted and resting. Still, the Soviet response was silence. Not a single official communique acknowledged the problem. Instead, internal documents were updated with vague language. Abrams survivability exceeds projections. No doctrinal changes, no shift in training. The system could not afford to admit it had failed. Instead, the blame was displaced. A classified analysis pinned the losses on Iraqi incompetence, improper fire discipline, it said, failure to employ smoke or concealment. Another memo suggested sand might have degraded the sabot performance of the 125mm rounds. Further testing required, it concluded. But beneath the surface, panic was setting in. Design bureaus began requesting emergency reviews of existing armor packages. T-80 modernization plans were quietly accelerated. And in Kharkiv, engineers working on next-generation active protection systems suddenly saw their budgets double. The truth was unavoidable. The Americans had fielded a tank that could dominate the battlefield while taking hits that would obliterate anything in the Soviet arsenal. And worse, they had done it while the Soviets were looking the other way. Moscow could not admit it, but it could not ignore it either. By March 1991, Soviet intelligence analysts had formulated what they believed was a rational explanation. The Abrams wasn't invincible. It was just facing weak opposition. The theory, compiled by the GRU and circulated among Armored Forces Command, claimed that the American tank's dominance was the result of Iraqi battlefield failures, not American technological supremacy. It was a comfortable illusion. The report cited poor Iraqi crew training, outdated fire control systems, and substandard ammunition storage protocols. Iraqi tankers, many of them conscripts, had logged only minimal time in live-fire drills. Some had never fired a round from a moving platform. Others had received their assignments just weeks before combat began. The conclusion, even a Soviet T-62 in competent hands could outperform the T-72s under Baghdad's command. This theory gained immediate traction in the Politburo's military circles. It allowed them to preserve faith in their own weapons. The T-72 wasn't flawed, only misused. A face-saving doctrine emerged in Soviet hands. The same tank would have fared far better. The Abrams' success was contextual, not categorical. But this analysis was quickly undermined by other battlefield evidence. One intercepted U.S. communication mentioned a scenario where an M1 took a hit at point-blank range from a T-72 during a surprise encounter in urban terrain and kept moving. Another featured an American platoon in a close-range firefight with a reinforced Iraqi armored company. 4 Abrams engaged more than 20 T-72s. All 4 survived. The Iraqis lost 17 vehicles. The numbers didn't lie, but the theory held, at least officially. Soviet tank exercises in the summer of 1991 continued as planned, with few adjustments. War games replayed European scenarios, assuming frontal mass attacks and short engagement ranges. No changes were made to simulate long-range duels, no upgrades to thermal sights or GPS-based fire control, no radical overhauls to defensive armor layouts. The reason was as bureaucratic as it was ideological. Admitting that American tanks were categorically better would mean admitting that everything the Soviet tank industry had built since 1945 was obsolete. It would mean invalidating years of military investment, tens of thousands of deployed vehicles, and the careers of hundreds of designers, engineers, and officers. Instead, they doubled down on a comforting fiction. That fiction would not last. The battlefield had changed, and Soviet armor doctrine was now chasing a ghost, one it refused to name. When the first theory that Iraqi crews had simply failed began to crumble under the weight of battlefield data, Soviet strategists reached for a second, more sophisticated explanation: the Americans had cheated. This theory emerged not from frontline commanders, but from the Electronic Warfare Division of the Soviet Air Defense Forces. The claim U.S. forces had deployed electronic countermeasures so advanced that they were blinding the T-72's fire control systems before the tanks even saw the Abrams. To support this, analysts pointed to a series of radio intercepts where Iraqi tankers described their systems malfunctioning mid-engagement. Rangefinders locking up, turret motors freezing, radios going dead. One report from the Karbala region described a full tank battalion losing comms seconds before being struck by unknown attackers from over 2,500 meters. The conclusion was that the Abrams wasn't just a tank, it was part of a fully networked battlefield. Satellites, airborne radar, electronic jammers, and real-time targeting data fed directly to units on the ground. The T-72, by contrast, was alone. It saw what its commander saw, fired based on human estimates, and relied on analog optics. It wasn't a fair fight. It was an ambush carried out in digital silence. The theory gained momentum after U.S. forces released footage from thermal gun sites. Soviet engineers were stunned the resolution. Target acquisition speed and tracking fidelity were years ahead of anything in the Soviet arsenal. The Americans weren't seeing the battlefield, they were mapping it in real time. And yet, once again, the Soviet response missed the point. Rather than confront the systemic failure of their tank doctrine, the theory became a justification to invest in more jamming, more countermeasures, more electronic armor enhancements. Projects were greenlit to develop active camouflage, radar-absorbing coatings, and electronic decoys. But none addressed the core problem the Abrams could see first. Shoot first, and survive the return fire. By now, some voices within the Ministry of Defense were sounding alarms. One memo, circulated privately among senior officers, was blunt. This is not a technology gap, it is a systems collapse. They are no longer fighting the same war. But those voices were ignored, blinded by their own assumptions. Soviet planners failed to see that the battlefield had evolved beyond platforms. It had become a network, and their tanks were now ghosts in someone else's machine. Inside the granite walls of the GRU headquarters in Moscow, the corridors were quiet, but the war rooms were not. Soviet analysts sifted through intercepted transmissions, captured footage, and burned out wrecks smuggled back by advisors from Baghdad. The mission was urgent figure out how American armor had rendered the once feared T-72 not just vulnerable, but irrelevant. What they discovered was damning and years too late. For decades, Soviet military intelligence had measured enemy strength by the number of tanks, not the architecture behind them. When U.S. defense contractors began replacing analog sights with thermal optics and digital fire control systems in the 1980s, the GRU noticed but did not understand. These upgrades were listed in reports, but their operational impact was dismissed. One internal memo from 1984 had even mocked the switch to GPS navigation in U.S. armored units. Unnecessary Western reliance on satellites, it said, cannot match the discipline of map-trained crews. That memo would become infamous after Desert Storm, when U.S. tanks maneuvered at night with pinpoint accuracy, while Iraqi divisions became disoriented and trapped in the open. The GRU also missed the full integration of air-ground coordination. While the Soviets maintained separate doctrines for tanks, artillery, and air assets, the U.S. had spent a decade fusing them into a seamless kill chain. Forward observers riding in Bradley vehicles could call in airstrikes in under 2 minutes. Apaches and Abrams operated in tandem, sharing data and carving up enemy columns before a counterattack could be organized. This level of integration was something Soviet doctrine hadn't prepared for, and Soviet intelligence had failed to anticipate. The crowning error came in 1989 when a U.S. Army demonstration at Fort Irwin tested the full capability of M1 Abrams tanks, equipped with the latest thermal systems. The GRU had eyes on the event photos, telemetry, and an entire report, but the conclusions were neutered. Technology appears promising but unproven under combat conditions. 2 years later, that technology wiped out 3,700 Iraqi tanks in less than 100 hours. Even worse, Soviet planners had underestimated the speed of American logistics. When the U.S. landed Abrams units in Saudi Arabia, analysts estimated it would take a month for them to be combat ready. It took 9 days. Full armor battalions rolled into position with spare parts, fuel depots, and satellite uplinks already in place. The final admission came in a confidential GRU post-mortem. We prepared for a mirror battle, but what we saw was a system war. We knew what they built. We did not understand what they created. By the time that understanding arrived, the war was over. The Abrams hadn't just survived. It had redefined the battlefield, and Soviet intelligence, long regarded as one of the most fearsome spy machines in the world, had missed the transformation as it happened in plain sight. What Soviet generals had dismissed as American excess, the endless streams of funding, the overlapping technologies, the seemingly redundant networks was, in truth, the most advanced combined arms system ever deployed. It wasn't one tank that defeated Soviet doctrine. It was the system that carried that tank, fed it data, hid it from enemy eyes, and helped it strike with lethal precision. At the center stood the M1 Abrams. Yes, but it was never alone. From the moment an Abrams left its staging point in Saudi Arabia during Operation Desert Storm, it was enveloped in an information web. J-STAR's aircraft tracked enemy armor movements in real time. AWACS platforms monitored the skies. UAVs then still in their infancy scouted routes ahead. Satellites supplied infrared imaging, and GPS directed units with meter-level accuracy. All of it flowed into field commanders, then straight into the platoons rolling toward Iraqi lines, Soviet T-72s. Despite their numbers and fearsome 125mm guns, were isolated. They had to see the enemy to shoot. The Abrams only had to know. The American logistics machine also defied belief. Fuel convoys stretched for miles, guarded by armored escorts and supplied by precision-planned routes. Maintenance teams rotated through units in motion. Combat engineers laid bridges and cleared paths with GPS-based synchronization. Every Abrams had a support team watching its performance temps, fuel flow, system health before it failed, inside the tank. The difference was stark. Thermal sights allowed Abrams gunners to lock onto targets invisible to the naked eye. Stabilization systems let them fire on the move with shocking accuracy. And the depleted uranium rounds traveling at hypersonic speed punched straight through T-72 frontal armor at ranges the Soviet tank couldn't even detect. But the true revolution wasn't hardware, it was tempo. American units moved at night, struck first, and coordinated with precision across divisions. Every T-72 they destroyed was just a node in a larger structure being dismantled. Iraqi command posts, communication hubs, and supply dumps were eliminated before tanks even entered range. What Soviet planners thought would be a war of attrition had become a war of annihilation. There were no set-piece battles, no glorious tank duels. There was only the system finding, fixing, and finishing the enemy before he understood what was happening. Even Soviet advisors embedded with Iraqi units were stunned. One colonel, debriefed weeks later, simply said, "They were everywhere and nowhere. We couldn't see them, but they saw us, always." This was not the war the Soviets had prepared for. Their blueprints, born from Kursk, refined in Czechoslovakia, and practiced on the plains of East Germany, assumed linear combat. Push with armor, support with artillery, seize ground. But the Americans had rewritten the book. Instead of waves of armor, they sent precise strikes. Instead of mass firepower, they delivered orchestrated bursts of violence. Instead of grinding forward, they sliced through. In the end, the true American system wasn't just a fusion of tech and tactics. It was a war-fighting philosophy that turned every vehicle, every satellite, every transmission into a weapon. And when it arrived, Soviet doctrine, 40 years in the making, collapsed in days. It came south of Basra, a place no one expected to become a crucible. Flat desert terrain, sparse vegetation. Low ridgelines, nothing here, favored a defender. The Iraqi Republican Guard had fortified it anyway, anchoring a counterattack force of T-72s and armored personnel carriers, reinforced by artillery and shoulder-fired missiles. They believed they were ready. They believed the Americans would come the old way, columns through choke points, tanks massed in force. But what arrived was something else entirely. In the dead of night, M1 Abrams tanks from the U.S. 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment rolled through sandstorms, guided by thermal sights that turned night into day. The Iraqis couldn't see a thing. Soviet-trained officers struggled to read maps, to find bearings in the dust, to even understand what was happening. Then the shelling began, not from artillery, but from tanks firing with surgical precision from 2 kilometers out. By the time the T-72s began returning fire, it was already too late. Their rounds ricocheted off Abrams' composite armor like sparks off steel. Even direct hits to the turret at 800 meters failed to penetrate. One American tank took 3 strikes in quick succession. None breached the armor. Its gunner, unshaken, returned fire. The T-72 exploded instantly, its turret blown skyward in a pillar of smoke and fire. The Iraqi defense fell apart in under 20 minutes. Some crews abandoned their vehicles. Others fired blindly. A few brave gunners tried to maneuver and flank. But the American system adapted in real time. A-10. Thunderbolts circled overhead, cutting through armored columns with 30mm cannon fire. Apache helicopters launched Hellfire missiles into moving targets designated by ground observers. Drone feeds were patched to command centers miles away. What was supposed to be a Soviet-style tank slugfest turned into a coordinated kill box. Even Soviet advisors watching via radio links were appalled. One senior officer, attached to the 10th Armored Division, muttered that the battlefield had become a physics lesson force: mass, angle, speed. Except the Americans had rewritten the rules. They didn't need to see the tank. They needed to see the heat signature. And from there, it was just a math problem. The humiliation was not just tactical, it was doctrinal. Everything the Soviets had taught the Iraqi army about timing, formations, survivability, and counter-penetration failed. The idea that a T-72 could hold the line against a Western tank was dead. For 40 years, Warsaw Pact engineers had poured steel and pride into their armored regiments, and now it was being shredded by fewer, faster, better connected opponents. The wreckage told the story. Entire battalions of Iraqi armor burned in place. Some tanks had tried to reverse. Others were caught mid-turn. Thermal scopes captured it all. Tanks dying in motion, like dinosaurs caught in a meteor strike. When American crews rolled through the battlefield at dawn, what they saw wasn't victory. It was obliteration. And for the Soviet command, watching the footage days later, the verdict was inescapable. This wasn't just a defeat. It was a demonstration, not of strength, but of irrelevance. Their machines, their tactics, their legacy had all become obsolete in a single, televised engagement. By February 1991, the collapse was no longer tactical. It was conceptual. For Soviet planners, the war had exposed not just a gap in equipment, but a chasm in thinking. The fundamentals of Soviet doctrine, mass, momentum, layered defense, attrition had been shattered by a force that never intended to fight that way. The U.S. didn't win by doing more. It won by doing different. And the Soviet Union had no answer. Their armor had been outgunned. Their anti-tank weapons had failed to destroy. Their integrated air defense network had been silenced in hours. But it was the sheer speed, precision, and synchronization of American forces that rewrote the rules. The M1 Abrams was just one tool in a vast digital arsenal, and that arsenal had moved faster than the Soviet Union could even comprehend. It wasn't only that the T-72s were destroyed, it was that they never had a chance to fight on equal terms. This was an ideological rupture. For decades, Soviet doctrine preached material superiority through numbers, efficiency, and rugged design. It was an article of faith that enough tanks, enough men, enough planning could overwhelm any adversary. But here was a superpower less numerous, more expensive, untested in Soviet eyes, decimating their system with minimal losses. The American kill ratio in tank battles during Desert Storm was estimated at 85-1. Not a fair fight, not a fight at all. Inside the general staff in Moscow, the mood shifted from disbelief to dread. War games were updated, tactics were questioned. Some generals, behind closed doors, asked if Soviet industry could even build a tank to match the Abrams. Others argued that no tank alone would matter, that it was the system that must be rebuilt. But the economy was already collapsing. The state was unraveling. The time was gone. And so, for the first time, the Soviet military elite began to say what had once been unthinkable. They had lost the future. Not in Berlin, not in Cuba, not on paper, but in the deserts of Iraq, where American tanks proved that the next war would be won before the first shot was fired. Years later, the echoes of that desert clash would still haunt war rooms in Moscow. The red banner divisions that once roared through Red Square had faded into history. The Soviet Union itself, shattered by internal decay and strategic humiliation, had vanished. But the lessons of 1991 had not. Russian engineers dismantled, captured Abrams components in the 1990s. They studied the depleted uranium armor, the fire control system, the turbine engine. What they saw wasn't invincibility, it was evolution. The Cold War had been a race of titans building toward mass confrontation. But in the Gulf War, the Americans showed they had already moved beyond that paradigm. Today, remnants of those burned-out T-72s still rust beneath the sands of Iraq memorials, not to a lost war, but to a lost era. Meanwhile, the M1 Abrams remains in service, modernized, upgraded, still feared. Its silhouette is now a symbol not just of American armor, but of the moment when Cold War certainty crumbled beneath the treads of something faster, deadlier, and utterly unexpected. For the Soviet tank crews who survived, for the generals who watched from afar, and for the world that witnessed it unfold on live television, that battle marked more than the destruction of tanks. It marked the death of the myth that numbers alone could win, that mass alone could dominate, and that steel, without vision, could hold the line against the future. And as one Russian historian would write years later, reflecting on the war that shattered the Warsaw Pact's pride, we built for yesterday. They built for what we couldn't yet imagine.